we're going to talk a little bit about
No, it's your
my side.
turn.
Yeah, my side.
Yep.
Let's give Gage a break.
Yeah.
And we're just going to go into some travel stuff.
We're gonna pick a topic that's oddly enough, we could talk about this later, but it's taboo to talk about this topic for doctors, but not anyone else.
Okay.
So
Oh, really?
I like talking about this topic even as a doctor. So we'll
Mhm.
talk about my side of things eventually, but
Yeah, yeah,
I'm interested to hear,
yeah.
and I especially want to hear because you have experience with this in terms of the dynamic between working with someone who is a traveler and
Hmm.
who isn't a traveler,
Right.
and you're making different salaries and how that kind of affects your guys' dynamic. So I
Hmm.
think this is going to be an interesting because
Yeah.
if we're being honest, money is why most of us do a lot of things.
Hmm.
So this is what most people are going to want to know about. So I
Right.
think this is going to be interesting.
Right. And I think um, traveling in general has seen this boom due to money, as well as the opportunity to see places. I mean, I've been around travelers that say, I don't really care too much about the money, but the opportunity to see different
Hmm.
places has kind of enticed me. And then I've been around travelers that was like, I love what I do, but I also wanted to get paid a little bit more. And
Hmm.
so
Yeah.
that's why they made that leap. And most travel contracts vary from is if you're a nurse or something. I mean, you could go in for a strike and you're there for a couple days or a week.
Yeah.
In terms of radiology, typically we're looking at 13-week contracts. I've seen eights, I've seen 16s. It depends on the need. I've
Is
stayed
that
places. Yeah, go
is
ahead.
that exclusive to ultrasound, or is that also? I've some of the ultrasound or not but X-ray I think was 13 weeks too. So
Hmm.
is that like a standard thing, or is that just for you guys in ultrasound?
I think that's a standard. I think for nurse, I think for everything, and I don't know who exactly standardized it, but I know
Hmm.
that across the board, from nurses to radiology to physical therapists to all the different parts of the hospital, usually they go 13 weeks. And I think that's just because it makes it worthwhile. Because those a lot of times those first week, at some facilities you're going through orientation, you're going through training, you're meeting
Hmm.
like whatever they need to do, and so 1 week is gone, and then the next week you're kind of like learning the protocols or whatever it is. So then you got another week that may be gone, and so I mean, if you were 6 weeks, I mean, you you would
They're
be
paying
you'd
for
be
six, but they only get four.
exactly, you're in and out so
Yeah.
fast, and so they needed to make sure that you have enough time there, you make it worth their while. Although I know a lot of hospitals are trying to pull back on the travelers, but and I've
Hmm.
talked. And it's funny because I literally was talking to somebody this week, and they said, "Do you think it's going to go away?" And I said, "Like it's never going to go away. Like maybe it fluctuates. Like I've been places where at times, obviously during COVID, that there was no jobs. There was
Hmm.
no jobs for anybody in healthcare. I mean, the nurse if they're getting rid of the nurses, like you're like, oh, there's no jobs here.
Yeah.
And so it's going to fluctuate. It's a plentiful right now, but people are always going to need maternity leave. People are always going to be transferring jobs, and they have quick needs that they need filled now. I can't,
Hmm.
or I'm going to risk losing staff because I'm putting people on call constantly. I'm working people tons of extra hours, and they're tired. And they say, why would I stick around here when I see a travel job and I can go here or I can go somewhere else and be treated differently? They feel like they're being overworked, and so I feel like travel is always going to exist in some capacity,
Hmm.
um, but that capacity will change. And hospitals are going to continue to grow. I've known somebody who was able to travel at the same hospital for years, um, just because that hospital continued to see growth, continued to see turnover. Whether it was the management that's not doing something right, or they're just growing so fast, they're outgrowing their capacity, which that's a great thing.
Hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
and so travel, I'm here to tell you that travel is going nowhere. It will always exist. Now, if you need to travel, if you live in a small town and you say, I can only travel, because a traveler, you have to travel, they say approximately 50 miles away from where you live. The IRS says something like you can't get like a full night's sleep.
Yeah.
Basically, like you have to not be able to like make it home safely. But as the companies use about 50 miles, and I'm paraphrasing. You can look up exactly on the website
Yeah.
how it's. Um, but if you say, okay, I can go 50 miles away and that's the place I'm willing to go and that's the only hospital I'm willing to go at, obviously traveling might not exist for you. It's there for people to fill in needs further away from their home proximity. It's
Mm-hmm.
not there for people to necessarily abuse, and say you're a traveler, but you just travel down the street. Um,
Yeah.
and so I've known a lot of folks who were travelers, and especially when you live in a big state or something, you travel all over Texas or you travel all over California.
Mm-hmm.
Still considered a traveler because if you're going from, these are huge places. Um, and
Yeah.
so,
Oh yeah.
and so, yeah, that exists. Also, I was going to tell everybody, and this is something that, I'm astonished that people still don't know about, to make sure that you get your facts right about the GSA. If you are a traveler and you do have a home, or somewhere you rent, a taxable residence, you can, get these GSA per diem stipends. And so as a traveler, that's really something that you can use to help save more money. You get your hourly wage, which is your taxable wage. And then, if you go to Google, type in GSA per diem, it'll be probably the first one. Type in your city, your state, because it can vary city by city. I mean, if you live in California, but you live in Los Angeles versus living in Delhi, it's
Yeah.
definitely going to be two different places, of how much non-taxable income that you'd be allowed to make if you're traveling to a place around there. And then it'll cut out and it'll say, um, meals and incidentals. And so it'll tell you daily how much they can afford to pay you meals and incidental wise, as well as your housing, or they call it lodging. Um, and then you would take that number and you would divide it by, I believe, your hours you worked in a week. So 40 hours, you take the two numbers and you divide it by the amount of hours you worked in a week. And then you can add your taxable to that. And that can give you a rough guesstimate of um, your gross income that you'll take home. And now it's going to vary state to state, obviously, with
Mm-hmm.
your net, probably with your write-offs, and talk to a tax person
Yeah.
for that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's not my forte. But that way you can go, okay, like they're offering me, and this is something I tell all the travelers I talk to. Um, Go onto the website, find out how much they're paying you hourly, find out how much they're paying you for housing and lodging, and then go to the GSA and say, okay, does this calculation make sense? Are they taking some of my per diem money, that if you have a taxable home, that money that's your money, that's allotted to you for your
Mm-hmm.
travels. That's not a part of the middleman's money to take in and make. That's so you can eat and so you can house,
Yeah.
while you're away. And so I would go to bat for yourself, if you find out that if they say, well, that GSA, that's not what we use. It's literally it's a government website. And so it's what we use for sure.
Yeah.
Um, Legally, it's what they use. And so that's like something it still astonishes me. I go to places and travelers don't know that this exists. And so that's like number one, huge. Um, and and um, and that's where you can make a lot of your extra cash if you're able
Yeah.
to find a house that's $1,000 a month versus $2,000 a month. Then that's something that you can, keep for yourself as part of your lodging, because you're able to find a cheaper place. Maybe you can use that money to continue paying the rent, that you're paying back home. And I think that's where travelers like that, because they're like, and that's where the angst in the department gets. Well, they're paying this guy double what I'm getting paid.
Yeah.
And at the same time, as a traveler, we're coming in, we're staying at either Airbnbs or Furnished Finder. And so I don't have a bed, as a traveler. I don't have a TV as a traveler. I don't have a couch as a traveler. And so I need to find a place that's fully furnished, or I need to rent furniture, which is also very expensive.
Yeah.
If you're only somewhere for 3 months, 13 weeks, um, to rent everything to add up. So I don't think that the person at the hospital is taking into, um, connection, or that we're getting paid more, but we're also need to fill a lot of short-term needs that you already have, that you've purchased, that you own, that I have to rent. And so
Mm-hmm.
that hikes our prices up more. especially if you're in, if you don't. I think one of the hardest things I always recommend if you're going to a new place, this is just like an aside, if you can get a hotel or something somewhere for a week, go look at these places before you, if you're able to look before you rent. I've rented before. I've been very lucky, and I was able to rent places before seeing them sometimes, and it worked out. But I've heard other horror stories
Yeah.
of people getting
Or it
scammed.
didn't. Yeah.
Yeah, they're like running this place, and all the pictures look great, and they go there, and it's just like a really bad neighborhood, or it's really
Fake stuff.
scary.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
a lot of hospitals, especially I feel like the big hospitals, are located in sometimes not the best of areas.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
and so you go work at this hospital, and you're like, oh, okay, good price, go stay there. And then like your first day of work, they're like, where are you staying at? And you say, oh, I stay here. And they say, you might want to move. Like that's scary there. Like or so you can get in there and get that first week in there and maybe talk to some people and say, hey, like where should I live? And then start looking at those places, see a couple places, even if it costs a little bit of extra money to stay at a hotel or somewhere else for a week. It
Yeah.
might suck. It's worth it for people's safety, for people to feel comfortable. That's just my opinion of doing this for a little bit.
Yeah.
Uh, and so, yeah, that's just like a short tidbit that I wanted to throw in about the travel thing post.
So you kind of mentioned it a little bit, but can you reiterate the normal? Like you said, usually 13 weeks. Do you have
Mhm.
other options? Do different companies offer different lengths, or is it set by the hospital, or how does the contract length
It's really
work?
set by it's set by the vent. It's set by the hospital. The hospital says their needs, and they work with what's called a VMS. So it's a vendor management system, which is the middle person typically from the recruiting company.
Hmm.
And so the hospital will say, I have a need for this role, and the vendor will say, okay, well, I can fill that role for 13 weeks. Well, the hospital says, well, I know they're going on extended long-term disability. And so, short-term disability, I believe, is 6 months. Long-term disability is anything greater than. And so, if somebody's going on long-term disability and they're holding that role, we still want to fill somebody in. So, we need a contract filled for 26 weeks, and so that's what 6 months. Um, and so we'll fill that in, and then they'll reevaluate after that. And so it's a little bit of both. What and give and take in that, and then the vendor reaches out to the recruiting companies and says, my hospital at X has a job for 26 weeks. Who
Hmm.
can fill this role? And then the vendors work with specific recruiting companies. It's impossible for every vendor to work with every recruiting company. They open the door for as many as they can. There's a lot of companies. Some of the kind of not dirty things, but like more interesting things is when the recruiting company also owns the vendor. And so it's
Yeah.
like, they're double dipping,
Yeah.
essentially. But if that vendor opens it up to another recruiting company, and that recruiting company owns the vendor, then they take a percentage. And so if I am own the recruiting company and the vendor, I'll say, okay, somebody will say, hey, I found this person named John, and they can fill the role at Y company. And I'll say, well, okay, well, I'll allow you to fill that job at my hospital that I have the vendor for, but you're
Hmm.
going to give me a percentage of John's wages, or of what
Yeah.
you would make, however you want to do it. I get my percent. And so then it goes, okay, we're going to pay John, we're going to pay Y company, we're going to pay X company because we are the vendor,
Yeah.
um, and we're going to pay our recruiting company. And so then it can slowly start taking money away from whomever, whether that smaller company says, okay, we're just going to pay John a little bit more and we're going to take a hit there, or okay, we're going to pay John a little
Yeah.
bit less and we're going to
I
make that.
assume John gets scammed most of the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, and I think that's is a traveler. I feel like that's what we always think. We're getting scammed. We're getting
Yeah.
screwed. And I feel like everybody feels like we're getting screwed. And you don't really know. It's tough to know if you're getting screwed or not unless you can find out the bill rate, which is a really cool thing if you can figure out, if you are able to make friends with the manager during the interview, or HR or whoever knows the bill rate. I've been in interviews. It's kind of like an aside too. I've been in interviews where the manager says the bill rate is just going to throw a number out there, up $150 an hour. Say
Mm-hmm.
that's the bill rate. And so you're like, okay, so then that's like, and so if they come back and they're like, well, we're going to offer you this. And you're like, well, I know what the bill rate is. So I know that if you're offering me 70 or 80, like, man, like you're taking, or if you offer me 50, like, man, you're taking $100 an hour, like away from me. And that's what you
Yeah.
get. And so that's kind of an interesting thing too. And I've had those
Use it
conversations
as
with
a negotiating tool.
100%. You're like, okay, well, I know the bill rate is, so it should be this. And I'm, I understand we all want to wet our beaks.
Yeah.
And I think that's a part of, the business side that you guys, as we continue going through things, that I
Yeah.
really enjoy. You're gonna learn a little bit about me. I enjoy that,
Yeah. It
the
does. Yeah.
negotiating, that business savvy stuff as well. I find a lot of fun in that.